The storm had begun before dusk, rolling across the valley with a violence that rattled windows and sent livestock scattering for shelter. The town huddled beneath the weight of thunder, but in a forgotten corner, just beyond the outskirts where the dirt road thinned into grass, a dilapidated stable crouched against the wind. Its boards were splintered and gray, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Once it had belonged to a rancher who'd left in search of better land. Now it stood, like a skeleton of what it had been, an empty shelter for strays, and the desperate dot it was here that the young woman had been left. She was no more than 20, her dress torn and muddied from the rain, her hair plastered to her face. Each breath came ragged as she clutched her swollen belly. Labor had begun hours ago, too soon and too harsh, the contractions twisting her body until she could scarcely think. She had begged the townsfolk for help earlier that day, but doors had shut in her face and whispers had followed her retreating figure. She carried with her a scandal, a child born out of wedlock, and in the rigid codes of the settlement, compassion had been smothered by judgment. The stable smelled of old hay and damp earth. Shadows stretched long across the floor, broken only by streaks of lightning that flared through the cracks in the walls. She stumbled inside, half crawling, half dragging herself to a pile of straw in the corner. It was no bed, but it was all she had. She pressed her hands against her belly, murmuring prayers that dissolved into sobs. The pain came in waves, sharp and unrelenting, leaving her gasping in the intervals between. Every sound of the storm seemed to mock her isolation, the rain pounding the roof, the shriek of the wind, the rattle of a loose door hinge. She was utterly alone, and with each contraction, the realization grew heavier. This stable might very well become her grave. Memories surfaced as her body battled itself. She remembered her mother's gentle voice, long gone now, teaching her how to cradle a newborn calf. She remembered laughter in her younger days, before shame and hardship had settled over her life. And she remembered the faces of the townspeople, when she had pleaded for help, the way they turned away, as though her suffering were deserved. Those images burned inside her, fueling a mix of despair and fury. Hours dragged. Time in pain is strange. It stretches, folds, and breaks apart. She lost track of how long she had been in the stable. At moments she thought she heard footsteps outside, but when she called out, only the storm answered. At other times, she felt her strength slipping away so completely that she wondered if she might simply fade into the straw, her child never drawing a breath. A contraction wrung a scream from her throat, echoing through the rafters. She bit down on her sleeve to muffle the sound, afraid and ashamed, though no one was there to hear. Sweat soaked her skin despite the chill in the air. She tried to focus on breathing, the way she'd once been told women must, but panic clawed at her chest. How could she do this alone? How could any woman? In the pauses between the surges of pain, she listened to the storm and to the thudding of her own heart. She thought of the tiny life inside her, fragile and waiting, and forced herself to keep fighting. If she gave up now, both of them would be lost. The stable creaked as the wind pushed against it, as though the world itself pressed down on her fragile body. Somewhere above, water leaked through a gap in the roof, dripping steadily into a puddle that glimmered faintly with each flash of lightning. It was a lonely rhythm, marking the passage of time as surely as a clock. Her cries grew hoarse, her body trembling from exhaustion. She felt herself teetering on the edge of consciousness, slipping in and out of awareness. In her mind, the boundary between life and death blurred until all she could see was the straw beneath her cheek, the dark rafters above, and the endless weight of the child pressing to be born. And so she lay there, in the abandoned stable, a figure caught between despair and stubborn will. Outside, the storm raged on, uncaring. Inside, every heartbeat, every gasp of breath was a struggle against silence. No one knew. No one came, not yet. The first true wave of labor tore through her body like fire through dry grass. It was not the dull ache she had felt earlier in the day, the one she had tried to ignore as she trudged from one closed door to another. This was sharper, deeper, a force that bent her in half and stole the breath from her lungs. She clutched at the rough wooden wall of the stable, her fingernails scraping splinters loose as she tried to steady herself against the pain. It came again. A tightening that wrapped around her middle, crushing, insistent, unstoppable. She cried out, her voice swallowed by the thunder outside. The storm offered no sympathy. It only roared louder, as though the heavens themselves sought to drown her. She sank back into the straw, curling her body around her belly. Each contraction came closer than the last, each one building on the wreckage of the one before it. She tried to remember what little she knew of childbirth. Her mother had spoken of it once, in hushed tones, warning her that it was both the most natural and the most dangerous of trials a woman could face. "It takes strength," she had said, "but also faith. You must not fight it. You must let it happen." But how could she let it happen here, alone, with no hands to guide her, no water, no cloth, no warmth but her own trembling body? The stable was not a cradle. It was a tomb in waiting. She pressed her forehead to the straw, whispering broken prayers between contractions. "Please, not like this. Not here. God, don't let me die." Her words mixed with the sound of the storm until she could not tell where her voice ended and the rain began. The hours stretched on, marked only by her own suffering. Sweat plastered her hair to her face, ran down her neck, soaked her dress until the fabric clung heavy and cold against her skin. Her throat burned from crying, yet she could not stop. Each time the pain seized her, her cries burst forth as if ripped from the depths of her soul. Her body trembled with exhaustion. She could feel the strength bleeding out of her with every contraction. There was no one to wipe her brow, no one to hold her hand and tell her she was not alone. She had heard of women who died like this, alone in childbirth, their bodies found days later with lifeless babes clutched against them. That thought chilled her deeper than the storm ever could. Still, she fought. She bore down against the agony, forcing herself to breathe through it, to keep her eyes open when darkness tempted her with the promise of rest. Somewhere inside her, a fierce determination flickered. She could not let go. Not yet, not while her child still waited to be born. She thought of the tiny heart beating inside her, a fragile rhythm she had felt for months. She remembered the first time she had felt the child kick, a flutter that had startled her into laughter. That life, her child's life, was worth more than the shame the townsfolk had thrown at her. They could call her a sinner, a disgrace. But this child was innocent. This child deserved a chance to live. The stable shook under a gust of wind, scattering straw across the floor. She imagined it was a cradle, imagined she was safe within walls built to welcome, not reject. But the illusion shattered each time the pain returned, dragging her back into the raw truth of her situation. The storm was her only witness. It raged and howled, beating its fists against the world while she fought a quieter but no less violent battle inside her body. She felt herself stretched to breaking, her spirit pushed against the edge of despair. At one point, she screamed so loudly her own voice startled her. The sound ricocheted off the wooden beams and faded into silence. She lay panting, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts, her hands trembling as they clutched at the straw. Her mind swam in and out of clarity, flashes of memory, fear, and pain colliding. How long had it been? An hour? 3? The concept of time dissolved, replaced by the relentless rhythm of contractions. Each one became a world unto itself, a prison. She could not escape until it passed. Her lips cracked from thirst. Her body shook from weakness. her vision blurred at the edges. Yet still she whispered to herself like a mantra, "Hold on, hold on, hold on." The struggle was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. And though she did not yet know it, salvation was riding closer with every passing heartbeat, an unexpected figure who would step into that crumbling stable and alter the course of her life forever. For now, she endured, alone, broken, but unyielding. The stable was not her first choice. Hours earlier, when the contractions had first begun, she had walked slowly, painfully into the heart of town. She had believed, perhaps foolishly, that even if she was unwelcome, even if tongues wagged, at her back, no decent soul would turn away a woman about to give birth. Surely, she thought, someone would take pity, if not for her sake, then for the sake of the innocent child within her. But the town had other ideas. The first door she knocked on was Mrs. Callahan's. The older woman had once praised her baking. At a church gathering, years ago, back when her life had seemed right with promise. But when the door creaked open and the townsfolk matron saw her swollen belly, her face hardened like stone. "You've made your bed," she said flatly, "and you can lie in it. Don't bring your trouble here." The door slammed, leaving only the echo of her words and the sting of rejection. She staggered to the next house and then the next. At the smithy, the heat of the forge glowed bright, but the man inside shook his head without a word, his jaw tight with silent judgment. At the mercantile, Mrs. Yates stepped outside and drew her children in closer, as if her very presence were poison. The young woman pleaded, clutching at her belly, explaining the contractions had begun, that she needed help, that she feared for her life. But the merchant's wife only shook her head and muttered, "God's punishment comes as it must." Every door was the same cold stares, whispered gossip, the thud of shutters drawn closed. Some wouldn't even answer when she knocked. Others peeked through lace curtains, watching her stumble by with the same curiosity one gives a wounded animal. Unwilling to intervene, she had never felt so heavy, not just with the child pressing down inside her, but with the weight of humiliation. Each rejection cut deeper than the last. By the time she reached the edge of town, her cheeks were streaked with tears that the rain quickly disguised. Her heart pounded with more than labor pains, it pounded with betrayal. These were the people she had grown up among, the ones she had greeted at Sunday service, the ones she had traded goods with at market, the ones she had once thought of as her community. Now, in her hour of greatest need, they cast her out. She thought back to the moment it all began, when her swelling belly became impossible to hide. The whispers had spread fast. "She's ruined herself," they had said. "She carries shame in her womb." They never asked for the truth. They never asked about the promises that had been broken to her, or the man who had vanished when she needed him most. To them, she was guilty by sight alone, and so the town condemned her not with a trial, not with words carved in law, but with silence, with doors closed in her face, with the kind of coldness that wounds deeper than a knife dot. By the time she reached the abandoned stable, she had stopped asking for help. She no longer had the strength to beg. Each step was an act of will, her body racked with spasms that threatened to drop her to the ground. She pressed on because she had no other choice. The stable loomed like the only refuge left to her, a place fit for animals, not for a woman bringing forth life. But even that was more mercy than her neighbors had shown. Inside the dark, creaking shelter, she collapsed onto the straw, remembering every shuttered window, every scornful glance. Bitterness burned hot in her chest, warring with the fear already consuming her. What kind of people turned their backs on suffering so raw, so desperate? Yet in the shadows of the stable, her anger softened into sorrow. She realized that expecting compassion from those who had already judged her was like expecting the storm to hold back its rain. She was on her own. Her cries of pain rose into the night, but they carried not toward the town, where ears remained deaf, but toward the open plains, toward someone else, someone unexpected, someone who did not belong to that settlement of cold hearts. The town had turned her away, sealing its own shame in silence. And because of that rejection, the path was cleared for another, an outsider, one the townsfolk distrusted even more than her, to ride in and prove that compassion often comes from where it is least expected. For now, though she lay in the straw, shaking from pain and abandonment, unaware that her suffering had already set fate in motion, the storm had swallowed the prairie whole. Clouds pressed low and black, the kind that made nightfall come hours before its time. Wind swept across the tall grass in angry waves, carrying the scent of wet earth and lightning. For most, the storm was reason enough to stay inside. For him, it was simply another thing to ride through. The Apache rider urged his horse onward, leaning low against the animal's neck as rain pelted them both. He was a solitary figure on the open land, his long hair plastered to his face, his eyes sharp and watchful despite the weather. He had been on the move since morning, traveling toward a distant camp, but storms cared little for plans. He rode where the land allowed, keeping to his own path, seeking only shelter before night deepened out. It was then he heard it, a sound carried faintly on the wind, almost drowned in thunder. At first, he thought it no more than the storm playing tricks, a branch snapping, or a coyote's call twisted by the wind. But then it came again, clearer this time, a cry, human and raw. Not the cry of anger or fear, but of pain. A woman's voice. He pulled his horse to a halt. The animal tossed its head, nostrils flaring, restless beneath the weight of rain and thunder. The rider sat still, listening. Another cry rose, long and desperate, cutting through the storm like a blade. His jaw tightened. Whatever this was, it was not something a man could ignore. He turned his horse toward the sound. The outline of the town lay distant, its windows glowing faintly behind curtains of rain. He knew that place. He knew its people. They did not welcome him or his kind. Too many years of blood and mistrust stood between Apache and settler. If they saw him now, they would not ask why he had come, only drive him off with guns and curses. But the cry had not come from the heart of town. It had come from its edge where no light burned. He pressed onward, scanning the shadows until the broken silhouette of a stable emerged against the sky. Old boards groaned under the storm, the structure sagging like a weary beast. And there, through the gaps in the wood, he saw flickers of movement. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. The horse snorted, uneasy, but he left it tethered to a post. The rain soaked him to the bone, but he moved with quiet purpose, stepping toward the stable. Again the cry reached him, weaker this time, but full of suffering. He pushed the door open. The scene inside struck him like a blow. A young woman lay sprawled in the straw, her body twisted with pain, her face pale and glistening with sweat. Her hair clung to her temples, and her lips trembled with every ragged breath. She clutched her belly with both hands, as though sheer force might hold the child inside her. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of the door, wide with fear. At first, she thought it was a trick of her fading mind, the storm conjuring shapes out of shadows. But no, he was real. A tall man, dark-skinned and rain-drenched, framed in the doorway like some figure stepped out of the storm itself. An Apache. Her heart lurched. Fear and relief tangled inside her. She had heard stories all her life, whispered warnings of raids, of riders who swept in with fire and arrows. Yet here, in her moment of greatest need, it was not the town, not her neighbors, but this stranger who had come. The rider did not speak at first. He simply took in the sight. his keen eyes flicking from her to the straw, to the shallow rise and fall of her chest, to the blood already staining the hay beneath her. He knew this struggle. He had seen women of his own people brought to the brink of death in childbirth. He knew the dangers, the helplessness, the thin line between life and loss. The woman tried to speak, but only a sob escaped her lips. Please. That one word was enough. He stepped inside, closing the storm behind him. His presence filled the small space, not threatening, but steady, grounded, like the earth itself had walked in to hold back the chaos. Kneeling beside her, he touched her forehead lightly, testing the heat of her skin, then pressed a hand against her arm to steady her trembling. His voice when he spoke was low but firm. "You are not alone," he said. The words were simple, yet they landed in her heart with the weight of salvation. After hours of rejection, after doors slammed and voices turned cold, someone. She had been taught to fear, had not turned away. The Apache looked around the stable, gauging what could be used, what little there was. No blankets, no clean water. Only straw, wood, and his own knowledge. It would have to be enough. And so the rider who should not have come, who should not have cared, knelt beside a woman his enemies had abandoned. And in that ruined stable, the course of two lives shifted forever. The moment the Apache stepped fully into the stable, the air shifted. The storm still roared beyond the walls, rain dripping steadily through the roof, but inside there was a new weight and anchor against the chaos. The young woman, writhing in the straw, clung to his presence as though it were a lifeline. Another contraction gripped her, wrenching a cry from deep within. She clawed at the ground, desperate for something to hold on to. He caught her hand and pressed it firmly against his own, steadying her trembling fingers. His grip was strong, but not harsh, unyielding in a way that told her he would not abandon her. "You must breathe," he said, his voice low but commanding. His accent was unfamiliar to her ears, yet his words were clear. Slow, deep, do not fight it. She tried, gasping raggedly, forcing air in and out as he guided. His tone carried an authority born not of cruelty, but of necessity. She followed it because there was nothing else to follow, no midwife, no mother, no friend, only this stranger who had answered her cries when all others had turned away. He moved quickly, scanning the stable for anything useful. A weathered saddle blanket hung in one corner. He tore it free, shaking off dust and straw. Not clean, not soft, but better than nothing. He folded it and placed it beneath her head. Then he took off his own outer shirt, wringing it dry as best he could, and set it aside to be used as cloth. From a pouch at his side, he drew small bundles wrapped in hide. Herbs remedies he carried always, for sickness, for wounds, for life on the trail where no doctor could be found. He broke one bundle open, the pungent scent of sage and wild mint filling the stable. Crushing the leaves between his palms, he held them near her face. "Breathe this. It will give you strength." She inhaled shakily, the sharp aroma cutting through the fog of pain. For the first time in hours, a sliver of clarity returned to her eyes. The contractions came harder now, closer together, each one threatening to tear her apart. Her screams rose into the rafters, then broke into sobs. I can't do this." He leaned close, meeting her gaze with eyes dark and unwavering. "You can. You will. Do not speed death when life is waiting." His hand pressed gently against her swollen belly, gauging the child's progress. His people had midwives, healers who taught the ways of birth. He was no woman, no midwife, but he had watched, he had learned, and he had carried knowledge others might not expect. Of a warrior. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "When the pain comes, do not hold back. Push, let the child come." She sobbed again, shaking her head, but when the next wave of agony seized her, instinct overpowered fear. She bore down, crying out, clutching his arm with the strength of desperation. He stayed with her, solid as stone, speaking words she half understood, half only felt the rhythm of reassurance, of endurance. Minutes stretched into hours, though neither of them counted the time. Sweat poured from her body, soaking her dress, mingling with the blood that now stained the straw. Her face turned pale, her lips cracked from thirst. Several times she felt her strength ebbing so low she thought she might slip away. Each time he pulled her back. He pressed the cool herbs to her lips, lifted her head so she might sip rainwater caught in his hands, whispered, "Stay, for the child, stay." Outside, the storm began to ease, thunder rolling farther across the plains. Inside, the battle raged on. At last, the moment came when the pain reached a fever pitch, sharper and more consuming than before. Her scream tore the night in two. Apache knelt low, ready, his hands steady despite the storm of her agony. "Now," he urged, "push with all that is left in you. Do not stop until life comes." She obeyed, body and spirit straining together. The world narrowed to the sound of her ragged breath, the pounding of her heart, and his voice guiding her through the fire. And then sudden, fragile, miraculous, the cry of a newborn broke the silence. The child had come into the world, but the battle was not over. The infant's cries faltered, weak and sputtering, barely a breath between them. The Apache did not hesitate. With practiced movements, he cleared the child's airway, rubbed the tiny chest, coaxing, commanding life to remain. "Breathe," he murmured, as if sheer will could pull the child from the edge. The mother, half conscious, watched with blurred vision, her heart seizing in terror. Her voice cracked. "Please, save him." The Apache did not look up. His focus was absolute. He bent close to the child, whispering words in his own tongue, urging, calling, refusing to let death claim what had just been given. At last, a sharp, piercing wail filled the stable. The infant's tiny body shook with breath, weak but alive. Relief crashed over the mother, tears spilling down her cheeks. She reached out, trembling, as the Apache wrapped the child gently in his shirt and placed the bundle against her chest. "You both live," he said quietly, and though exhaustion dragged her toward darkness, she clung to those words as if they were the very breath of God. The storm had begun to roll away, its fury spent, leaving only a steady drizzle that tapped against the sagging roof. Inside the stable, however, the battle was not yet won. The young woman lay in the straw, her body racked with exhaustion. The Apache knelt beside her, his shirt torn and stained, his hands steady despite the weight of what they carried. The child had come into the world, but not safely. Not fully. The newborn's cry had been faint, a flutter of sound rather than the full-throated wail of life. Now, wrapped in the Apache's shirt, the tiny body shuddered weakly. The baby's chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a fragile thread that might snap at any moment. The mother reached out with trembling fingers, her voice barely a whisper. "Why? Why doesn't he cry?" The Apache did not answer right away. His dark eyes studied the child with grave intensity. He had seen this before. Infants born too weak, too silent, their spirits hesitant to cling to the world. Some lived. Too many did not. But this one, he decided, must. He placed the baby gently on a patch of clean straw, then leaned close, his hands working with a calm precision that belied the urgency. He rubbed the tiny chest, firm but careful, coaxing breath into still lungs. He cleared the mouth and nose with a sweep of his finger, tilting the small head just so. Then he lifted the infant, holding it close to his lips, in his own tongue. He spoke softly, words that carried the weight of his people's traditions. "Little one, take breath. The world is waiting for you. Do not turn away." He drew in a deep breath and released it against the child's face, warm air urging tiny lungs to remember what they were made for. Then again, rubbing, coaxing, commanding. The baby let out a weak sound, not quite a cry, more like a whimper. Not enough. The mother's sobs filled the stable. Please, please don't let him die. The Apache's jaw tightened. He refused to. He bent lower, pressing his lips against the infant's nose and mouth, breathing life into the small body. He had learned this from the elders, from women who had saved babies on nights just as desperate as this one. Breath for breath, strength for strength. Again he rubbed the chest, his large hand dwarfing the tiny rib cage, urging it to rise and fall. At last a sound split the silence, a sharp, piercing cry. Not strong yet, but full enough to carry. The baby's lungs caught the rhythm, crying louder, shaking its small fists in protest at the world it had entered. The mother gasped, relief flooding her pale face. She stretched out her arms, desperate to hold her child. The Apache lifted the newborn carefully, wrapping it again in his shirt before placing the small bundle against her chest. The baby's cries softened as it felt her warmth, the rise and fall of her breath. The familiar beat of her heart. Tears streamed down her face as she looked from the infant to the man who had refused to give up. Her voice cracked, raw from hours of screaming. You saved him. You saved us both. He shook his head slightly, as though deflecting the praise. Life was already inside. I only reminded it to stay. She clutched her child tighter, her body still trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. Her strength was nearly gone, but her spirit surged with renewed determination. She had not suffered in vain. Her baby was alive. That truth alone filled her with a fierce, aching joy. The Apache reached for his herbs once more, pressing leaves into her palm. Chew this. It will give you strength and slow the bleeding. He busied himself with what little could be done, straightening the straw, fashioning a makeshift cradle with a saddle blanket, preparing the fire he coaxed from damp kindling. His movements were purposeful, practical, yet there was a reverence in the way he worked, as though he understood he was in the presence of something sacred. The storm outside had stilled to a whisper, as if the heavens themselves bowed in silence to the moment. The stable smelled of earth and blood and smoke, yet within it there was also the sharp, clean scent of new life. For hours she had believed the stable would be her grave. Now, with her child's cries filling the night, it had become something else, a birthplace, a sanctuary carved out of rejection and despair. She looked once more at the Apache, this stranger who had arrived when no one else had dared, and a thought pierced her through the haze of fatigue. Perhaps God had not abandoned her after all. Perhaps he had sent help from the most unlikely of hands. The child nestled against her breast, drifting into sleep. The mother's eyes closed too, not from surrender, but from peace. She knew that when she woke, the storm would be gone, and, though the road ahead was uncertain, the moment of birth had changed everything. The night was nearly spent. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the dripping of rainwater from the eaves and the soft sigh of wind across the prairie. The stable, once filled with cries of pain and fear, had fallen into a fragile quiet. The newborn's breathing, steady now, was the only rhythm that mattered. The young mother lay in the straw, her chest rising and falling weakly, but with life in it still. Exhaustion had dragged her close to unconsciousness, yet she would not release her hold on the tiny bundle pressed against her chest. Every now and then, the infant stirred, letting out a soft cry that reassured her with its sound. She kissed the damp crown of the baby's head again and again, as if she could not quite believe he was real, as if each kiss tethered him more firmly to the world. The Apache sat a few feet away, tending the small fire he had coaxed from wet kindling. Its flames glowed low and steady, enough to chase away the chill and offer warmth to both mother and child. He had laid his weapons aside in the corner, his rifle leaning against the wall, his knife sheathed at his belt. In this place, in this moment, he was not a warrior. He was a guardian. He watched her carefully, noting the pallor in her cheeks, the way her breath sometimes hitched. She was not yet safe. Childbirth left women drained, and blood still seeped slowly, though not dangerously, thanks to the herbs he had given her. He knew she would need more rest, more food, more care than this ruined stable could provide. But for now, survival was enough. Survival was victory. She stirred, her eyes opening halfway, finding him through the flicker of firelight. For a long moment, she said nothing, only looked at him, her gaze heavy with gratitude and disbelief. Finally, her voice emerged, hoarse but steady. "You saved me." The Apache shook his head once, his expression unreadable. "You saved yourself. You endured." Her lips trembled into something like a smile. "No, I wouldn't have made it. He wouldn't have made it." She looked down at her child, adjusting the bundle in her arms. "I thought I'd been left here to die." He studied her face, the traces of suffering still etched into it, the strength that had carried her through. "They left you," he said quietly. It was not a question. Her eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back. "The town? They all turned me away. Said I deserve this." Her voice broke on the last word. Heavy with bitterness, the Apache's jaw tightened, but he said nothing for a while. He fed another piece of wood to the fire, sparks rising briefly before fading. Finally he spoke, his tone measured. "A people who turn away from life, they are already dead inside." His words struck her, sharp but strangely comforting. For the first time, she felt her shame begin to loosen its grip. She had believed the town's rejection defined her, that she was unworthy of compassion. But here was this man, this outsider she had been raised to fear, who had seen her not as shame, but as a mother fighting for life. The baby stirred again, letting out a soft, almost impatient cry. She guided him to her breast, and he latched. Weakly at first, then with more determination. Relief flooded her as she watched him feed, his small body drawing strength she had feared he would never have. Tears spilled freely now, falling onto his dark tufts of hair. The Apache watched silently, but there was a softness in his eyes that did not match the sternness of his face. He had seen too much death, too much cruelty. To witness this life restored, hope reclaimed, was something sacred. When the child had finished and drifted into sleep, she looked at the Apache again. "Why did you stop? Why did you help me?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because life is worth saving. Always." The simplicity of his answer left her silent. She could not argue with it. She could only hold her child tighter, feeling the truth of those words beat in the tiny heart against her chest. For the first time since the ordeal began, peace settled over her. Not complete, not permanent, she knew there were trials yet to come, but peace enough to close her eyes, to rest, to believe that she and her child might see the morning. The Apache kept watch by the fire, his silhouette tall and unwavering in the glow. Outside, the prairie breathed again after the storm, the land renewed. Inside, a mother and her newborn slept, alive against all odds, and in that fragile quiet, the truth became clear. The stable was no longer a place of abandonment. It had become the place where life was restored. Dawn crept slowly across the horizon, painting the prairie in pale gold and gray. The storm had scoured the land clean, leaving the air sharp with the scent of rain and earth. Birds began their morning calls hesitantly, as if testing whether the world was safe again. Inside the stable, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The mother stirred first, her body sore and weak but alive. She opened her eyes to find the Apache still there, seated near the doorway, his rifle across his knees, watching the light spread across the plains. He had kept vigil through the night, a silent sentinel guarding both her and her child. The baby slept against her chest, warm and breathing steadily. She looked down at him, marveling at the steady rise and fall of his tiny body, and a wave of gratitude washed over her so strong it brought tears to her eyes. She remembered every rejection, every door closed in her face, and then she remembered the moment this man had stepped through the storm into her darkness. Everything that mattered now flowed from that single choice. When she tried to rise, pain lanced through her, and she sank back into the straw with a faint groan. The Apache turned his head at once. Without a word, he knelt beside her, offering a hand for support. She shook her head, forcing a tired smile. "I'm all right, just weak. You will need rest," he said, "and food. More than this place can give." Her gaze flickered toward the town, visible in the distance now that the sky had cleared. She thought of the people there, the ones who had turned her away, who had condemned her with silence and scorn. The thought of returning filled her with bitterness, but she knew she had little choice. The baby needed more than she could give. "Alone. They won't want me back," she whispered. The Apache's expression was unreadable. "Let them carry their shame. You have none. You carry life." The words cut through her doubt, anchoring her. For months she had believed she was marked only by disgrace, that her child was a symbol of ruin. But now, holding him in her arms, she felt something stronger than shame. She felt purpose. Together, they left the stable. The Apache led his horse forward, steadying her as she climbed onto its back, cradling her baby against her. He walked beside her, hand on the reins, guiding them toward the town dot as they approached. Curtains twitched and doors cracked open. The townsfolk gathered slowly, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and disbelief. Whispers rippled through the crowd at the sight of the Apache walking beside her, his presence a defiance of every prejudice they held. But even more shocking was the sight of her alive, her child alive. When all had expected her to perish in that storm, she met there. Eyes one after another. Some looked away in shame. Others held her gaze, their expressions uneasy, guilty. No one spoke. Not a single voice offered apology, but it did not matter. She shifted the baby in her arms, pulling the blanket tighter around him. His small face peeked out, peaceful in sleep, untouched by the cruelty of those who had rejected him. The Apache stood tall at her side, silent but unyielding, as if daring anyone to question the worth of the life he had helped bring into the world. In that moment, the truth became undeniable. The people who had turned her away had shown their cowardice. The man they feared, the one they called enemy, had shown compassion, courage, and strength beyond any of them. The story would spread, whether they wished it or not. Whispers would carry it across the valley, beyond the settlement, until it became more than a memory. The young woman knew this. She felt it in her bones as she walked past the staring eyes. Her child's first breath had been fought for, protected, cherished not by those who claimed to be righteous, but by the one they scorned. That legacy could never be erased. Years later, she would tell her son the story of his birth. She would tell him of the storm, the rejection, the stable where death had seemed certain. And then she would tell him of the Apache, the stranger, who rode in when no one else would, who saved them both, who changed everything. The child would grow up with that story as his beginning. It would shape him, strengthen him, remind him that compassion knows no boundaries of blood or tribe. And for the mother, the memory of that night would remain etched forever in her heart, not as a tale of suffering, but as the night when life triumphed, when courage defied prejudice, when hope rode in through the storm. The stable was left behind, but its legacy endured. It was no longer the place where she had been abandoned. It was the place where she and her son had been restored.